Welcome to late October office hour. We're here with Nell, Liz, Christy, and Alan. Alan and Christy are in my current Harvard class. Excellent. Liz has been in classes with me for a long time, and Nell was in my Harvard class last fall and has since done a couple of private workshops with me. So here we are. I have one question that Kim wanted me to touch on with regard to transitions, but you guys are here, so let's start with questions that you guys have.
Maybe this will fall under the transitions category, but
Yeah.
I sometimes feel like when I'm going from a flashback or somebody's internal memory and then I'm going back into the present, it can be sort of a clunky transition. Like, you don't want to say like, well, suddenly I realized he was talking to me, or, you're you want the focus to come back into the present. And I feel like sometimes I'm not good at doing that. Is that what you mean by transition?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Well, so the big point that I'm making these days about transitions is that there are three kinds of transitions, which you guys have probably all heard me say a number of times, but I will do them here. The three kinds of transitions are place, time, and point of view. So, and so those are the really general concepts for transition. And now in our class, we're getting a little bit more into narrative distance transitions, which are more subtle than point of view, but we could say hypothetically that they fall into the same category. So the really big thing with transitions initially is just to know when you're making them. And that's where people really get into trouble, is when they don't know they're making them. So they're switching point of view and they don't recognize that as a transition. They're switching narrative distance and they don't know that's a transition. And so these are things where the reader can get really lost. When you're doing flashback, you're talking about a transition of time and place. And so, at the base of it, if you are actually conscious of that transition and you're trying to do it, even if it's clunky, the fact that you're trying to manage it is like the really important start. Like you know what you're doing, you're trying to manage it, and you're on the right track. And then from there, I think what happens a lot is that people try to make transitions really quickly. Like one thing that they'll do is just have like scene break and then jump into the next scene. And that Carver example from Put Yourself in My Shoes really shows how he like basically ends a scene and then gives like sort of a wind down of that scene, sort of a denouement or something that just makes for connective tissue. I'm really into the idea of connective tissue these days. If you're doing any kind of exercise, people are probably talking to you about your fascia and how you have to roll them out with those big, whatever color, white, blue, or black or gray rollers. In my day, everybody was all about stretching, and now stretching is like de rigueur. Everybody's got to roll out your fascia, and that's more important. So fascia is the connective tissue that goes under our skin and connects all the stuff. And if you're thinking about fascia with regard to your story, this is the connective tissue that a lot of early writers don't have because they think they got to keep the pace moving along. They're worried about their reader getting bored. They're worried about if it's moving fast enough. And so a big part of what we've been doing in class is me trying to get people to slow down. But in those transitions, if you look at what Carver does in Put Yourself in My Shoes, and there's a video where I go over this that I can share with people if they don't have it. He really sort of like, there's a first scene ends with the end of a phone call where they're going to meet at the bar. And then the rest of that scene is him hanging up the phone, getting his coat on and going to his car. He starts his car, he starts driving, and then there's a scene break. So you've got that white space. And then after the white space, he's driving, he's seeing the snow on the houses or the buildings. He's seeing the other Christmas shoppers. And, because of the way that he handles this, we learn a tremendous amount about the character. We see his body in space. We see him driving in the car and understand how he looks at the others and sort of views them as happy Christmas shoppers. And he's kind of making himself an other. And this is sort of a part of his depression or whatever. But the writer is really able to show this stuff in a way that we can connect to the reader, connect to the character, and start making a read on him. And that's the connective tissue that I think is so important that people often want to just get rid of and just go from like end of scene. Yeah, I did everything that I needed to do in that scene. Done. White space. Next scene. And so with the Carver example, rather than just jumping from the end of the phone call to meeting his wife at the bar, he leaves the house, starts driving, scene break. He's driving, he gets to the bar, he goes in, and when he enters the bar, that's an opportunity to give a view of what that setting is like. What does the bar look like? Well, where's the door when he walks in? What table does he sit at? All of this stuff does so much to ground the reader, and that is really where my focus has been in the teaching lately, like getting writers to ground the reader, and that's what the connective tissue does. So as a general term, that's what's important. And when you're coming out of a flashback, there's a lot of different ways to do it, but as long as you're being careful and just, be mindful that your reader might have the mental facility of might be physically like a little old man, and you sort of have to just lead him carefully along the trail as opposed to just like jumping him over this chasm.
Right.
Seth, I have a question. As far as transitions and talking about time, I'm having issues with jumping weeks and months and how to do that, because I can do things like the next week, blah, 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 or, the next day this happened. But when you start jumping to the next month, then you have this big chunk, and it's kind of awkward to go next month this happened, so how do you deal with scenes and the connective tissue if you end one and say May, and then your next one doesn't pick up until July or something?
I think you have to go to sort of the changing of seasons, and maybe that's hard to do in San Francisco where the seasonality isn't all that pronounced, but there is some sense of seasonality. Like you have your rainy season, you have your not rainy season, or you have tourist season and not tourist season. I would look at something like that. I mean, one of the things to do is to look at published work and find where writers that you love do it. And, so when I have this problem and I'm looking to make transitions, I'm generally looking to do weeks and days. And I have enough trouble with those as it is. So going to seasons or months is definitely hard. But, I think the same principle as we were just talking about with the connective tissue, give yourself some room to do it. Don't feel like you have to do it in a sentence. Maybe you have something that says in May in San Francisco, a lot of sailors start to hit town and walk around in their white uniforms. Ship week or something like that. And you can sort of, take a couple sentences or a paragraph to kind of build that and just sort of have that confidence in yourself to take it slow and give it the space that it needs. And when you have that confidence in yourself, it encourages the reader to have that confidence in you as well.
Okay. So kind of grounding the reader in the circumstances of the setting, kind of?
I think so. If you, and then you're sort of metaphorically getting at the change in character. If you can get at the change of seasons, which is something that everyone can relate to, then you can compare that to the change in your character as she gets further into this new job.
Okay.
Something like spring in New England brings awesome yellow flowers and leaves budding out on the trees. at the same time, Nadia had gotten used to her job and every day would go to coffee at 4 o'clock with Thomas, something like that. Her training
Right.
sessions with Rune had gotten comfortable, and she was getting to the point where she was trying to make this happen and that happen.
Okay. Well, I like that comparing it to, like, kind of making blanket statements, maybe like, this is what it was like in the East Coast, but now this is what it's like on the West Coast. Kind of like comparing it to ground, I guess.
Comparing it to what?
To comparing, just like comparing things, like what the character notices about the seasons, to kind of like get into it, I guess.
Yeah, I don't think you want to compare East Coast and West Coast, but like compare where she is. Give a sense of, I mean, you know what the seasons are like there. Think about it and figure out some way to compare it. And then, that becomes something that's general to your reader. And then you can go from there, a general concept that the reader will relate to give something that is more specific about the character.
Okay.
Jane is struggling mightily with technical difficulties. Jane, let me know in the chat if you want me to give you the phone number. I can do that as well. Yeah, no? And then Alan?
Oh, just on the topic of transitions that Liz was bringing up, and this is a great conversation. For instance, I have something in which things are happening all in one day or all in the space of a half a day, but with different characters. So when I'm jumping from one scene with one character, I'm going to another scene, and it's almost like I'm retelling that person's story over time that's already lapsed in the other scene. Do you know what I'm saying? There's like overlapping time sequences. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you're like jumping backwards.
Yeah. In other words, like, while so-and-so is at the bar getting a drink, she's sitting there, and meanwhile, 2 hours preceding, Jim's, taking a shower, kind of like it's like a timeline, but then there's like overlapping timelines. So it's hard to do that, but I feel like I've kind of mapped out like the actual day, like here, this is how long the minutes are taking for this person. And so that I can see in my mind when someone is doing their activity, the other people are doing X, Y, and Z. And I feel like I'm just going to have to try to write it that way and see if it works, right? I mean,
but that's almost like you're addressing the reader. It's almost like you're really altering the narrative distance to sort of give the reader these specific signposts, like these explicit, like this was happening at this time, and now we're going 2 hours earlier. That might work, and it might be very technical. Another thing that you could do is like, if we left Jack and he was about to get in the shower, then maybe we go to someone else, and then when we go back to Jack, he's just gotten dressed or something like that, and the reader remembers enough to put those pieces together. It doesn't really matter what time of day it is.
Right.
You're just making the connections between the different things for each person.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
I feel like with the connective tissue, that it's. I think that the problem I struggle with is that seeing the computer and the YouTubes and the TV and stuff, everything's so fast paced. But I think what I'm sort of hearing from this is that, or at least what I'm understanding is, the reader doesn't have, all they have are the written words. And so they don't have any of that other visual stuff. So we don't have the luxury, the ability to bring them in without giving them all the extra stuff. Because this ties in with my other part, which is something that you said before, which is, I think it's something like this: don't be too concerned about whether you're boring the reader or something like that. Maybe I'm saying it wrong. I thought you had said it, or maybe King said it. I'm not sure, Stephen King. But I can't help it. I find like when I'm writing and I read things over, I just find like, boy, I hope it's interesting. I hope I didn't lose them there when I read it out loud, etc. So yep. I guess my question is, I'm making a statement. My question is, can you talk a little bit about why we shouldn't be afraid to bore our reader, because that concerns me during that.
Yeah.
But Ellen, I mean, just stepping in here before Seth answers, think about some of your most favorite thriller books or books that have a lot of action. I mean, I'm not a big fan of slowing down because I'm bored writing it, which I shouldn't be, but I do find writing the connective tissue boring. I want to be writing all the action. But when I read the books that I love, all of them have it. And I'm never bored because I'm following the character in time and space. I think that's the thing to think about is that, I mean, it may not be the most exciting pieces and the most fun pieces to write, but I do think that any of your favorite books, if you go back and look, even the most exciting ones have that connective tissue, I'm going to guess.
I think there's also, I'm hoping that there's a difference between being bored writing something and having it be hard. Like it's hard to sometimes write that connective tissue and maybe you want to jump to the next piece. But sometimes it's you have to do that hard work to sort of make the connections, to make the whole thing a single structure.
It's a great point. I feel like it's definitely harder whenever I write a paragraph of connective tissue than writing the action. I find it's much more difficult to write the former.
Yeah. So what does that tell you?
That I'm not that good at it, or that's probably part of it.
Well,
I need to practice.
Yeah, you need to learn how to do it. And, you know, I'm of the mind that if your writing feels very easy, there's probably a problem there. Like when you're writing and it just seems easy, like think of the people in our class or in any workshop that you've been in who just are like cranking stuff out and have no sense of the quality of it or how to evaluate the quality of it. They're like having a great time writing along. And as you start to learn more about the craft and how to really make it work, then, you know, it can be difficult. It's not as fun. It gets more fun later on when you start to have readers and people really responding to it. But when you go beyond that initial point to really start to hit your learning curve, it gets harder. And sometimes, you know, I think fundamentally, like if you want to make money or have a hobby, for some reason you've chosen writing and it's hard. And there's a reason you did that. I've got a reason. Everyone has their own reason, or whatever that belief is. And writing is hard. And so sometimes if something feels hard to do, that means that you should be doing it, that you should be doing it. It needs more work. I mean, the thing that's kicking my ass right now is working on an Amazon blurb for my book. And I need to like figure out how to write a description of the book that has a hook, a synopsis, a call to action, and some other marketing garbage. And it's like, it's not fun for me, but I need to learn how to write that. And so, you know, I worked on it a little bit yesterday. I took a crack at it today. It's slowly getting better. And, you know, maybe if I do a lot of these, I'll be able to whip them off more quickly. But now this is a real challenge for me, and it's something that I need to learn. And so you guys are taking a class. You're finding the parts that you're not comfortable with, and you need to learn how to do them. And writing into those learning parts is hard. Like maybe you're good at dialogue or you're good at action. When you find the parts that you really need to work on, that work is going to be hard at first. But to get back to your original question, Alan, about being afraid of boring the reader, what you're learning is a tool set for connecting with your reader. You're learning a skill set and a series of tools for how to write well, as we watch Nell make the bed, or not make the bed. So this is what we're doing, right? We're learning a series of tools to write well. And the things that you do well, you have a set of tools and you have an aesthetic for how to do it effectively. When we're first coming to something, we have these fears. I'm of the belief that if you're using a sense of how to do something well and a skill set for doing something effectively, you're going to do a better job of it than operating out of your fears. If your fears are guiding your decisions that you make, I think your decisions will be less good than if you're using some sort of higher level insight and thought process. So like, I'm afraid of boring my reader. It's pretty low hanging fruit. It's pretty much bottom of the barrel. When you start writing, you have that. But the better writers and the ones that Christy's talking about, they have the confidence where they're not worried about that at all. They might go off on a weird tangent for a couple of pages because it feels fun, and they know that their readers are going to go along with them. I mean, some writers are so good that you would read I would be willing to read their grocery list because they just write that well. Like Dennis Johnson, I'll read anything he writes, and it's just fascinating because he's a great writer. I don't know what the hell Murakami's doing in his latest book, but people love that stuff, and he does the million weirdest things you could ever imagine. And so giving yourself some of that freedom to move away from being worried about boring your reader is really going to open up so much in your fiction. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
It's like if you're worried about, sometimes you have to leave a job or something, or you have to leave I don't know. I could come up with any number of life situation things where people might do something out of fear. And then if they have another really strong reason for doing something, figuring out why they would do something based on the stronger thing than fear, I think is going to guide them better.
I would agree with that. I think that sounds great.
Yeah. So you're ready to leave that a little bit. And this isn't to say that you're going to start writing Henry James, but you have internalized that fear of boring the reader, and you don't need to have that be the prevalent thing in the front of your consciousness while you're writing.
I think part of it also is, I don't know what you guys all feel your experiences are, but like when you write something, King gets into this, but when you write something, what do you do with it next before you've submitted it to a literary magazine, before you've shown it? I mean, I won't bore you with my anecdotes except to say, typically I'll show my wife, and I'm not always thrilled with the response that I get, but she's a different person with a different mind than I have. So I'm not sure what the best way to deal with it is. Obviously we'd like to submit something to somebody and they immediately say, I couldn't put it down, I loved it. But that's not what seems to happen as often as we'd like. So I don't know what any of you guys feel about that. But.
Well, yeah, so that doesn't happen to anyone. Like, nobody ever just has that happen. There was a guy that I was working with who was a really good writer. I read his stuff and I really liked it, but he kept workshopping things with the same problems. And essentially he was just workshopping things and waiting for people to say, I love this, this is ready to go. And he never got to the point where he was doing revision. It was like he would write these great pieces that were good rough drafts, but he needed to revise them and take them beyond rough drafts. And every time he would put something up, we'd say, this is good, and you've got all these problems that you have in every one of your things. And eventually he just stopped workshopping because it was like, for whatever reason, he just didn't want to put that work in. And so none of us just have that thing where we just whip it off and, it's heralded and praised and published to grand money. We all have to do revision, and what you do with your piece after you finish it, or after you finish a draft of it, there's as many answers to that as there are writers, and it's a pretty separate conversation. Yeah, no?
I would only add that, for me, when I'm writing something that's really fresh and feeling like a, newborn infant, or maybe it's like still gestating, that's not something I necessarily show to my husband, for example, because I just don't like what he has to say. And I feel like, I love my husband, of course, but we're very different people. He's going to have a totally different view of things than I do. And I feel like I've kind of learned, like, that's not my reading buddy. That's not my reading guy. I need to find, and I have a couple of other people I go to, and we're all fine with that. It's like your spouse or your partner, or your best friend isn't always your best reading pal.
Yeah.
So I'll just throw that in there.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, your spouse or whatever might read a totally different genre than you want to write, and that's what it is. Yeah, that's a good point now.
Well, I think part of it is that you need to find kind of like an internal motivation for why you are writing. Because if you're looking for people to just love everything that you write, you're looking for an outside validation. And, some people are going to like what you write and some people are not going to like what you write, and that's fine. But I think you need to kind of decide, the satisfaction that you get internally for doing something. And for me, like writing's really, really hard. And I struggle every day. I'm trying to write. And, it's like feels like very like ego shattering. But, I'm trying to get better. And for me, getting better is like personal little accomplishments if I can figure something out. And that's kind of the internal motivation of why I keep writing. Because people aren't necessarily going to like what I write. It's not their genre. It's not their thing. And as far as like showing people, I think you kind of know, like what Nell was saying, like who you show it to. Because, like for example, my husband is like my biggest cheerleader. He never finds any fault in anything I ever do, and
Yeah.
it's not useful.
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
like it's great if I need like a pick me up of like a little boost of ego, but like
Yeah.
he's not gonna ever tell me like how to make it better or criticize anything about it. And so for
Yeah.
me, that's not useful feedback of how I'm gonna get better.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing is like, yeah, you might get the super critical spouse or you might get the super positive spouse. And, either one of them has problems. Like just getting only positive feedback all the time, after a while,
No, it doesn't
no,
mean anything,
yeah,
you know?
yeah, exactly. Unfortunately,
I do
yeah,
rely my husband to say, keep going. Like, that's really useful. Like, oh God, this sucks and I hate this and why am I even bothering? And I just want to end this. And he'll say, keep going. And like that is helpful advice,
Well, a couple things that I would say too is that like when you're in a workshop with people, whether it's a class or whatever, you're going to find people in that workshop that get your stuff more than others. And so those are the people that you can approach, whether it's email or whatever, and just say, hey, I like your stuff. I like your read on my stuff. I'd like to spend, maybe after the class we could connect and do this more. And you've done that with Andrew now. And, I always encourage people in my classes to do that. And so sometimes I've found that people never follow up. And so that's why I started doing these private workshops, is because I was always encourage these people and say, like, you guys just spent 3 months getting to know each other and making a good community of writers. You should take this and start meeting independently. And so when people kept failing to do that, I said, okay, I'm going to organize them and you guys come over. And so now there's a good group of former students that keeps meeting, and it's great. And I guess my original point is just like when you're in a workshop with people and you find people who are simpatico or sort of get where you're coming from, talk to them and say, hey, I'd like to keep reading your stuff after this. Can we do that? But I was really interested by what you said, Liz. Like, I love that idea of, I mean, so I was just having a conversation with Nell that was about, at some point, the positive feedback and the reward system has to come from within. And it sounds like you're giving yourself those rewards or hearing that positivity by figuring out these puzzles. Can you say more about how you see that and how it makes, how do you
Yeah.
get how do you get the Liz is doing well stuff out of that?
Well, so I just started this book actually last night, Flow, and it was talking about like when you're in kind of like in your groove, and the like real only satisfaction that people get out of life is like overcoming obstacles and kind of, becoming really good at the thing that they do. That's what gives people satisfaction in life and
Yeah.
happiness in life. And so for me, I think having these little puzzles of, how do I fix this little part of the scene? It's like these little, like, every time I can fix one little bit, it's like a little gain, a little bit of forward momentum. And because you just, you want to just write something and it's amazing first draft, and that never, ever, ever happens. Or if it did, then you don't know enough to know that it's really crap. So I think, just figuring out each of the little puzzles, like breaking things down into little sections of how to fix things. And then once I figure it out, it's like a little internal reward. I get the little rat getting a little piece of cheese or something, like, oh, I figured that out. And so then you just keep progressing very slowly, obviously.
How do you know when you figured things out? Are you like looking at comments from readers and then like changing those things?
I think you have to trust your intuition about when you know something is good or not.
How are you knowing that they're bad?
Well, I either get criticism or I can look at something that I write and I just know, like, oh, that's crap right there. Like, that needs to be better. And I think as you become better readers and critiquers of other people's work, you kind of can figure out what is done well or, done in an interesting way. It's kind of like you get this, set of facts and like all these words, and it's like how you apply them in different ways. And there's like no set recipe for how you do it. And so I think it's just when you figure out like what works in that certain circumstance, then you just kind of know, it like clicks a little bit about like, okay, maybe it's never going to get 100%, but that's 90% and that's good for now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. And you also learn how to read your own stuff by reading other people's stuff in workshop.
Yes, definitely. I think definitely, and I try to read all genres. Like I just read all sorts of things. And I think that's really good because sometimes if you only read in your genre, like writing urban fantasy, if I only ever read urban fantasy, I'd be like narrowing the confines of what's possible, because the way that things are done in urban fantasy is very different than literary. And so I feel like the more that you read and the more experience and the more that you critique in those different categories, then you're going to be able to pull the little bits that really are true for what you want to do in your writing.
Yeah. So lately, one thing that I've been doing is like, if I'm looking over comments that I've gotten from a copy editor or a proofreader, or things that I've noticed myself, sometimes I'll make a list of things that I need to address, and then I can feel good when all of a sudden that list is gone. Like I'm deleting things as I go through it. All of a sudden the list is gone. It's like, oh, I don't have that work to do anymore. That's great. But I think part of the premise for me is that like finding those things in writing where you get something positive from yourself and know, oh, I did that well, or oh, I did something that I deserve a carrot for. It's hard. I think it's hard to find that because it's not set up to work that way. So for me, like I get that sometimes from the daily goals with my word count. But yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to find ways to build in some sort of self-driven or self-given reward system.
Well, one thing too that I've noticed in my writing is that, because I'm going back to the beginning and like re-going through it again, is that things that I were fine with, 6 months ago, I've learned since then, and now they're not, like I need to redo it based on what I've learned. Yeah. And so I think that, just understanding and kind of being kind to yourself that this is like a process and like a learning process, that every time you're just trying to get better. And every time that you go through something, you're going to find something different based on the new things that you've learned. And so just kind of understanding that, like be kind to yourself, like treat yourself like a child and don't yell at yourself for failing something. You're just trying to learn here. So
yeah, for me I think that's really good advice. I've been giving that to a couple of people lately, and sometimes that can be really hard to do. It's hard to be kind to yourself sometimes.
Yeah, I'm trying to work on that. Give myself a hug.
It's a good growth edge. Yeah, sometimes when we do writing exercises in class, I'll say like, okay, now pat yourself on the back. And in an on-ground class, it's like, okay, now pat your neighbor on the back. And it's like, little things like that. I tried to tell someone the other day, like, You're doing a really good job. You should go buy yourself a milkshake. And the milkshake wasn't this person's thing, but you know, sometimes you can find a reward. I had a friend a long time ago who used to say, like, just go spend $20. And it's like, if you take $20 and like go find something to spend it on, there's going to be some enjoyment in that. I think. Give it a try. Not on Amazon. Like, you have to go to a store. I don't know. Anyway. Yeah. A lot of good stuff there.
I had a question. Changing subjects, is that okay?
Totally.
Yeah. So obviously in my workshop, we discovered that I have a bad habit. And so what I'm wondering is, you know, when you get yourself stuck in a bad habit, right? So mine is, what are they called? Gerunds? I don't know. This came up in my critique group last night too. So my writing
Oh,
is,
they came. Yeah, good.
yeah, littered with it. So I have completely turned this into a crutch. And so what I'm trying to figure out though, is when I'm looking at, you know I got this crutch because I was trying to vary my sentence structure in the first place. So where are some good places? I mean, I know I can read other people's work to study sentence structure, but I'm making too many movies in my mind. So it's really hard for me to really break down the words as far as how it's not boring. And so because I'm too sucked into the story. So I have a hard time breaking down other people's writing when it comes to how do they create a varied sentence structure that's not ing. You know, or not falling into that habit. So is there a place to find how to increase or better your sentence structure variety, I guess?
Can I suggest one book? It's called Very Short Sentences or something like that. It's by
Klinkenborg.
Klinkenborg.
Oh my God. Someone just gave me that. Did you give me that?
I know maybe I've mentioned it before, but a friend of mine told me about it, and it's really inspiring to just dip into it. And it literally is, he tells the whole book in very short sentences that are great sentences. And it just is I find it very helpful. So I don't know if it would be helpful, but that's one idea.
It's at least worth looking up because the writer's name is Verlin Klinkenborg. And I enjoy saying that. Someone gave that to me, and I hope they don't end up watching this, but I ended up not reading it at all, and I feel bad. I might have lost it.
I feel like it's good to dip into because it reminds you, oh yeah, break it up, or it sort of cuts your habit. Like, oh yeah, I can do this differently. That's what I use it for. Like, oh yeah, I can not do this the way I'm doing it. Let me rethink this. And that's what I find it's useful for.
I think it's really good that you're getting caught in your scene making and you're not thinking about the language. I think one of the things that you can do in revision to go back is just to you could diagram your sentences, which you probably don't want to do. You could read your thing backwards, one sentence at a time. Just start at the end and just read each sentence at a time and check whether the constructions are repeating again and again or not. And honestly, I would say Strunk and White. Good old Strunk and White, Elements of Style. You read that and that'll talk about different ways to structure a sentence. It's kind of boring, and you might not read the whole thing, but it's kind of good.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, that's where you'll find them saying, adverbial phrases can go anywhere in a sentence. And that is one way to vary your sentence structure is by moving adverbial phrases around if you're using adverbial phrases. And the ones that you're using are actually adverbial phrases, and you're sticking them at the beginning of your sentence all the time. Why are you doing that? But when I took a class at Harvard Extension 20 years ago, my teacher said, you can never start your sentence with this kind of word.
Which was the ing word?
Gerunds, yeah. She said you should never start any sentence with a gerund like this.
I had a teacher tell me that too.
I just blocked it out altogether. Did I tell you that?
I must have forgotten that.
Different teacher.
Yeah. Ellen Cooney told me that a long time ago, and I just abolished them from my writing and never, it was hard, but the reason why she did it is because you get a verb before you have the subject of the verb, and so it's confusing. Yeah, Alan.
I'm going to change the subject too, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Through your course, I buy into the fact that we want it clean. You know,
We want to what?
that we want to have the writing clean. We don't want to have a lot of extra clutter.
Yeah.
But I do find some of the part that I would have a lot of fun with at some point, maybe not in this class, but at some point as I progress, is to, like Stephen King said, he said some of the most fun you can have is when you write a pretty metaphor, something that really, really sticks and works.
Yeah.
But, be careful. It's like, that's degree of difficulty in the Olympics when you're doing the triple axel or whatever. I mean, that's tricky stuff. You can really, you're treading on a dangerous area. I don't know if there's any way to address like any technique in that, or maybe it's like art and there's nothing really to learn about it, but I'd be interested if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, I'm not saying that your writing has to be clean. I'm not saying that, I guess I'm hearing you imply something that I'm saying that your writing needs to be sort of whittled down and short or concise. And I think the real point is that you really need to be in control of meaning, sense, and clarity. You need to be able to pull off every sentence that you write. And so if you're writing above your level right now, you need to simplify your sentences. And as you start to simplify your sentences and really get them all under control, then you can start stretching that boundary a little bit. Then you can start, once you're really good at hitting singles, you can try to swing for doubles. Once you're really good at doing whatever kind of basic dive someone is going to do, then you can start doing the triple axel or the triple Lindy or whatever. Like, you have to build up. And a lot of students that I see are writing above their heads. Conroy talks about this. We read above our level, so we end up writing above our level. And I'm not saying you need to write Hemingway sentences for the rest of your life. I'm just saying whatever sentences you're writing now, you need to achieve a high level of controlling them. And so one way to get better at that is to start simplifying your sentences. And then as you get a better level of control, you can go for harder sentences and start to have a little more fun with it. But
yeah, I mean, because I do think
if he's talking about the triple axle flip, maybe that's a skating metaphor, but you can't just build up a skating routine out of all triple axles. Like, you've got to build in this other stuff. And if you're trying to write a really fancy sentence, every sentence, sometimes it's too hard for you. It's too hard for the reader. It's not something the writer can pull off.
Clarity is a wonderful word, though. I mean, I really love it. I see my college. I've got 2 kids in their college. I see what they're kind of writing, and they're science guys. And when they want to write something good, they will dress it up so garishly. You know what I mean? It's just like with these stupid big words. It's all clutter. It's clunky. And there is something that's very nice about clean. I see that. I mean, I'm trying to do it, but I definitely can see it at least. That's the first step. So.
We write so much as a part of our culture now. We're writing emails, we're writing posts on this thing or that thing or whatever. When we're writing an email to a friend, we don't have any of that pressure on us. And some level of clarity can come out through that writing that you want to try to bring to your fiction. But your fiction, you're so worried and it's got to be so heightened and it's got to be so much better. The confidence can really help it with the clarity, and you sort of have to earn that. You earn the confidence by writing more stuff that's under your control.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to look at Kim's question real quick about the transitions in place. So she's got this story where these people are moving from different scenes. They're at the county fair, they're in the backwoods, they're at Selden's house. She's discovering that someone might be at her house. How to make smooth transitions in a story. Later that afternoon, they arrived at the county fair, or when they arrived at the county fair. Should she do a scene break for each location transition? What would you guys say to that?
Well, I wouldn't break with the asterisks. These, especially since it's all occurring in the same day, I think that would be too disruptive. And usually if there's an asterisk separation, I'm usually thinking that's a POV transition or a pretty significant break. And I don't think any of this qualifies as a significant break.
Well, Carver used those in his story, and that was all in the same day.
What's Carver? I think they're
What does that mean?
disruptive. I think as a reader, I find too much clutter on the page. I just don't like that kind of thing. And I don't associate as asterisks. I assume those with usually a bigger break in time, space, or.
What if it's just a white space without the asterisk?
I like that. That doesn't bother me at all. And I don't mind later in the afternoon either, like she suggested, or after they were done with the fair, they wandered into the woods to go hang no trespassing sign.
So I think when she says an asterisk, she's just talking about like a white space, like a double space break.
Oh, I thought she meant the actual asterisk, which I hate.
I think she does mean that, and I'm going to say that that is the same thing as like just a double space break. So are you opposed to that if it's just a double space break?
Not as much. No, as far as visually, it doesn't bother me. I just don't like when there's a lot of different, between the italics and the asterisks and the dashes. There's people who just put a lot of different stuff all over their page, and then your eyes kind of bouncing all over as you go through it. And I think it just disrupts narrative flow. I think a double paragraph works for sure. I mean, it's just.
I like what you said though. Like it disrupts narrative flow. Like narrative flow and narrative tension are really hard to earn, and once you get them going, those are things that you want to endeavor to keep. So it's like flashbacks and these other kinds of transitions can take away from those. So that's why to do less of them, or why to stretch out the connective tissue more like Carver does.
Are those all separate chapters, or they're just separate scenes in the same chapter?
I'm going to say she's writing a short story, and they're all in the same short story. I would say, one thing about doing the space breaks, to go back to what Nell was saying earlier, or what I said to Nell, is like, if you're doing the space breaks, at least you're acknowledging, like, you're telling the reader, this is a transition, something is changing here. And that kind of like resets it for the reader to understand, okay, this is something new, as opposed to just like kind of popping through sometimes with unclear language. And then maybe a couple paragraphs down, the reader's like, wait a minute, I thought we were still at the fair. Where are we now? What's going on here?
That's what I was going to say, is that even if you have the, whatever it is, the double space, you still have to situate the reader. I mean, you've sent the signal, a transition is happening, but you haven't said what that transition is. Is it a different location? Is it the next day? Is it what? Where are we shifting to? Right. So, I mean, I get the issue of clutter and visual and so on. I'm with you on that, but that still doesn't answer the question about how you resituate the reader in that next phase.
I think this is an example where you need to have a higher priority than worrying about boring the reader. And this gets to sort of the question that I answered for Liz, which is like, you take your time, whether it's like the movement of a couple months or it's the movement of the county fair to the guy's house or the backwoods. You take your time by giving us a paragraph with a sense of where they are now. And she gives us some examples there. Later in the day, Savannah and Sam arrived at the county fair. Later in the day at the county fair, Savannah was walking arm in arm with Sam. Something to get it visual as quickly as possible, and not just trade on the language of like county fair, backwoods, but like to start to show some visual, to spend some time grounding the reader, to put what Jane just said another way, to ground the reader in this new time and new place with visual elements.
I've also seen it done well, depending on how important each of those scenes are. You could even break it apart by, in the woods, and, have a header for each one, like a semi break. I think Didion did it in one of hers. I've seen it, it's some of it's done well, right? Before, this is what happened. I think on one of her essays when her husband died, right? So this is what happened before. This is the kind of the progression of time, so she broke out her time in one of her essays that I thought, worked well. I agree, depending on where you're really setting up, each one of those has to stand alone as their own scene.
It's almost like you're giving them a title.
Almost. I mean, it's almost like mini chapter breaks. If it's a short story, I guess is what I was thinking. If you don't have that.
But talk about clutter on the page. Now you're really getting to page clutter.
Well, sometimes, but it depends on how many pages you've got in each section. And it's a possibility depending on how important each of those scenes are and what the meaning is in each one of those.
I don't see that done a lot in short stories unless it's semi-ironic.
You know what a good example of this is? That Laura Vandenberg story, Arctic or something, where she does a lot of time travel and mood travel, and she goes back and forth a lot. Maybe whoever had these questions, that story, she does it really masterfully in that story, I felt.
Antarctica is the name of the story?
Antarctica, yeah. That might help. There's a huge number of transitions in that story, and I hardly noticed them,
But within that, I would say that this writer's scenes and transitions are smaller and would encourage her not to go that route with the major section breaks and titles. In the Vandenberg story, like, she has major shifts from like Antarctica to the past to the future to Brazil or Massachusetts or wherever.
Yeah.
When she's within an Antarctica section, she'll have like, they're in the diner, they're in the snow, like these. And so she's able to make those transitions within a section. And I think that's more like what this writer is trying to accomplish.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, I would say like that kind of stuff to do with some focus on grounding the reader and a minimum of bells and whistles. Yeah. But to focus on the connective tissue and grounding the reader primarily.
I've just discovered, and I'm still really new at this, obviously, but I've just discovered the fun of, in dialogue, showing that people are moving somewhere else. Like, hey, where the fuck you going? Or, like, have something like, I love now that it's so much fun to do it within the dialogue and to just make action and movement happen between bodies. Yeah. Without saying, and now I've gone over to the left, and now I'm going out the door, So anyway, I this is apropos of nothing. I don't know why I thought of that, but anyway.
Take your finger out of your ear.
Yeah, take your finger out of your ear, exactly.
But what I really like is double duty with using character actions to tag their dialogue. So it's like, you're really annoying, and instead of saying he said, say something like, Thomas put his coffee cup underneath the table.
Yes. Because
you have those two things, the dialogue and the character action in the same paragraph, the reader knows that that's who spoke.
Right.
And it's a good way to get double duty and economy. And it really enables you to vary up your dialogue writing so that you're not saying said, and you're not saying said and said while simultaneously, side while moving, all these things.
Right.
Yeah, I think a big thing about that gerund thing, Christy, was to understand that the sense of meanwhile that you were often assuming. Did that come across to you? Did you understand what I meant by that?
Yeah, no, I get it. No, it's just a way I just have fallen into to keep the movement happening.
Right.
It's just a crutch. No, it's just like any bad habit that you pick up. So it's just unfortunate that now I have to fix it.
But sometimes it's like A, then B, then C, and your thing was like A while B while C. Yeah. Yeah, it's worth just looking at. I think that's, once you see that you're doing that, it's not that hard to correct. You should be able to ride some whip on that. But also you can just take care of it in revision for the most part.
True. It's just figuring out, okay, but how do I make interesting sentences? I mean, I think it's hard, it's easy to write and it's easy to revise. I think what's difficult is how to not constantly be starting your sentences with, the pronouns or the person.
Hey, Christy, like you helped me earlier on another one. I honestly, I think on this, I think when you get to it, that you will find it'll be easier than you might think it'll be. I think that when you get there, you'll, it's probably a little bit of a shock to see, oh, well, this is a repeated pattern. I can't fix this. My guess is you're not going to have to go to any resources, etc. I think that you're just going to be able to look at it and you'll try to write simple sentences. She walked to the toilet. She lifted the bowl and leaned over.
But you don't want to be, you can't start all your sentences with the person either. And that's dull. You got to keep the sentences lively and interesting. So.
Well, you can do a hell of a lot more sentences like that and then see what happens.
What do you mean?
Like start a bunch of sentences simply and clearly with the subject. And then, you know, it's like you're operating out of a fear of doing that too much. So you're not doing it at all. Allow yourself to do that.
No, that's not true. Now we've gone too far, folks. We have gone too far. I can't do that. That will physically hurt me to write everything he said, she said. I can't even stand the pain that's even thinking about it's giving me.
I'm just saying you could do some of that. And as you start to do that, you will come up with other things.
I'm going to look at the books.
Yeah, I don't want to freak you out. Yeah, so a lot of good stuff there. You know, when something like that is bouncing up against the inside of your forehead while you're writing and you're thinking, oh, I can't do this sentence, Gerund, I can't do this, I can't, you know, sometimes that can be difficult, and it's a sign that you're learning something. And you should take some of Liz's advice and find a way to view that as a positive and give yourself some credit for it. Oh, I'm learning something, so I know this thing. And I'm getting better, and my writing is getting better. So, positive steps always. And we're about out of time. Very good to see all of you guys. I look forward to seeing you online and in email and other places. And stay in touch.
Thanks, guys.